It is my honor to present Amy de la Haye, who is Professor of Dress History and Curatorship and Joint Director of the Research Centre for Fashion Curation at London College of Fashion, University of the Arts, London. She co-curated Ravishing the Rose in Fashion and has published extensively on fashion, mythology, and collecting. Please welcome Amy de la Haye.
Hello, thank you for inviting me to FIT. Today I'm going to explore some of the processes involved in making an exhibition, the objects, the narratives, and the curatorial interventions that are put in place, what we could describe as the backstory of an exhibition. I'm going to start by drawing some analogies between roses and fashion to provide an insight into the basic premise of the exhibition, and then I'll go on to describe the more practical components and some of the dilemmas and issues that the project has generated. The rose, the most ravishingly beautiful and fragrant of flowers, is inextricably entwined with fashion and dressed appearances. Roses, like fashion, are a luxury, and they're both ephemeral. Both are shown on catwalks and at flower shows, and certainly over the last year, more increasingly on digital platforms. Their appeal is multisensorial, and they're both avidly collected, and they both ignite passion. Not surprisingly, the rose and the savage thorns, although actually technically they're prickles, that protect it, which are a conjunction of opposites, have long inspired and provided a fertile source of inspiration for designers, writers, and artists who have variously drawn out allusions to love, beauty, sex, sexuality, sin, gendered identities, rites of passage, transgression, degradation, and death. Now, flowers, and roses especially, are a fashion mainstay, but in the 21st century, more than ever before, and most notably since about 2010, the rose has been harnessed by an increasingly politicized fashion industry, which I will go on to discuss. In 2019, I proposed the idea of the exhibition to Dr. Valerie Steele and was completely delighted when she gave me the go-ahead to work with fashion curator Colleen Hill, using the museum's incredible exhibitions and to stage an exhibition in the major exhibition galleries. The timeline of the exhibition necessarily, as always, coincides with the timeline of the collection. So we're going to look at rose-themed fashions from the 18th century to the latest gender-neutral collections. Over the last 200 or more years, the rose has variously ornamented fashion in terms of artificial flowers, fresh flowers. Many garments have been made from rose pattern textiles, or indeed have taken the flower's form. And here we have the work of a fascinating Japanese designer who works as part of the stable of designers called Haye Ninomiya, and he presents rose personification at its most militant. Futuristic and fantastical, wild and yet cultivated, Haye Ninomiya's rose anime march in fashion's vanguard. It's very rare that fashion takes new forms, and here the rose has inspired an extraordinary manifestation. The pink outfit is the image that we chose to put on the cover of the book. The book came out in September when the exhibition was supposed to be staged, but because of COVID it was delayed. So the book is out before the exhibition. And then subsequently, Dr. Valerie Steele bought the dress on the right, which is going to be a star object in the exhibition and will also be used for a lot of the publicity images. Nearly all my projects, whether I'm writing a book or curating an exhibition, they've nearly always been instigated by a desire to interpret either an individual or a group of garments or fashion-related documents. Unusually, this exhibition was inspired by three very different sources. The first is I completely fell in love with Nick Knight's sublime photographs, which he calls his roses from my garden, which he posts on Instagram. This stunning image he posted on Instagram on the 10th of October 2015, and then he subsequently worked them up into huge artworks. This one was exhibited at Albury and Barn between June and September 2019. So I completely fell in love with these beautiful, sensual roses. And I was really delighted as well because for the book, Nick agreed for me to interview him about his love of roses. The second source was a quote that I found maybe 3 or 4 years ago. And quite often you read a line of poetry or a line in a novel and you just hold on to it and think, I'm going to do something with that one day. So this line, 2 lines, for the roses have the look of flowers that are looked at, just really struck me as being incredibly beautiful, by T.S. Eliot from Burnt Norton in 1936. So I'd held on to that for some time too. And the third theme is my mother's absolute love of roses. Her whole life she's loved roses. She's got the most beautiful rose-filled garden. And so it was partly a tribute to her adoration of the rose. This striking and somewhat surreal shoe in many respects exemplifies the theme of the exhibition. It was designed by V. Busso. It dates from circa 1960. And it's called Rose Shoe. It's a crimson coloured suede. The heel part takes the form of rose petals, suede rose petals. And the heel takes the form of a 3-dimensional thorny branch. Now, thorns are often they're often depicted in flat textiles, but because they could snag skin or fabric, they're very rarely depicted 3-dimensionally, as we see here. And in the same way that fashion is inspired by roses, roses are also named after fashion designers. Here we have Christiane Dior's, the Rosa Christiane Dior, which dates from 1958. It was introduced by the breeder Myland in 1 year after the couture's premature death. The fresh flowers industry developed along the same sort of trajectory as the elite fashion industry. So from the mid-19th century, cultivated roses became a major global industry. And roses, like fashion, tell stories about migration, about cross-cultural influences, about international trade. The rose has been dated back staggeringly some 35 to 40 million years ago, and now they're near universal. Most museum collections are classified by object type, by gender, by sometimes by materials, by occasion, by period, by designers. They're not classified by flowers. And so Colleen and I embarked upon the most amazing research journey, going through every single cupboard in the museum's vast collection, looking for roses. Even when dresses have a flowery theme or a flowery textile, very rarely are the flowers identified. So we went on this fascinating research journey. This is one of my favourite objects in the museum. It's a day dress on a very filmy printed cotton in a muted palette with clusters of roses. It dates from about 1830 to 1833 and has these extraordinary gigot sleeves, which we might also liken to flowers. When you're exhibiting historical fashion, it also has more of a resonance with your audience if some of the aspects of that garment feed into contemporary fashion. And here we demonstrate, the current preoccupation with huge sleeves. What I'd like to say as well is that all the photographs that I'm showing of museum objects were really beautifully styled and skillfully styled by Fred Dennis and Thomas Cinnamon. And they were all taken by the museum's expert object photographer, Eileen Costa. It's the most wonderful quote which opens the book by Charles James. It says, "Fashion is a little like radium, or like essence of roses, which, if undiluted, would asphyxiate." This is one of the few garments from the museum collection that I was already aware of that was abundantly rosy. Various manifestations of this dress have followed me throughout my career, and it's one of my all-time favourite garments. It's by Charles James. It dates from 1937 and is called La Corselette, or also known as La Sylphide. On the left is a photograph of the woman who commissioned it. It was made as a debutante dress, Miss Esme O'Brien, who ordered it and had it made to fit her unique body in 1937. Roses are inextricably entwined with rites of passage, and often the clothes that are worn for rites of passage, such as debutantes coming out into society, obviously a very tiny minority of people, and for weddings and other ceremonial dress. Now, whilst most of us cannot, or necessarily even want to, wear the sort of elite fashion which is housed in a museum which focuses upon design, upon innovative fashion, upon craftsmanship, garments that are acquired as exemplars of design, roses grow around the globe. And so whilst most of us can't ever wear garments like the beautiful 1830s dress or the Charles James dress, almost all of us can look and maybe even feel transformed by wearing one or more fresh roses. So one of the theses that runs right through the book and in the exhibition is focused upon inclusivity, which is showing people coming to the museum and sort of seeing historical versions of themselves. So I started buying on eBay carte de visite, cabinet cards, and from about the 1900s, postcards, which comprise studio portraits of people who've gone to a photographer's studio and are variously wearing, holding, or have roses as props in the image. So on the left, we can see what looks like a fairly poor couple. The dress the female is wearing is certainly sort of understated and looks like an everyday dress, but she's completely transformed by the veil and the fact that she's holding a bunch of fresh roses. They render her experience as special. The centre photograph shows two men, both with a rose boutonniere, a rose buttonhole, and interestingly, one man is touching the rose in the other man's buttonhole. And slightly later, I think from about the 1920s, is an absolutely beautiful portrait of a woman seated in a photographer's studio with an abundance of fresh roses in her lap, which we might also liken to the overall appearance of the Charles James dress. Here are some more. On the left, I got quite interested in about gesture and pose, and how quite often in studio portraits, the pose is redolent of the sort of pose we see in painted portraiture. It was also really interesting to look at these photographs because, unlike garments in the museum collection, we could see how roses interfaced with the fashionable body. We could look at the scale of them and how they added to a woman's either performance in the studio or her dress. In the middle, the woman is wearing a large rose corsage. I don't know whether it's fresh or artificial roses. And the woman on the right is wearing a beautiful single full flower rose in her hair. I've had a really long-term interest in artificial flowers, but I've never before had the opportunity to study them in any depth. So I became completely fascinated and undertook a great deal of research about the making of roses in what were the major fashion capitals, Paris, London, and New York, until more recently. Here we have a detail of exquisite silk roses that frame either side of the face of a Christian Dior silk velvet skull cap with a black veil from about 1950. And here we have a very different hat. The museum's got the most amazing collection of hats, many of which haven't been exhibited before. And it's a brilliant opportunity to bring them out. But this is a bit of a museum favourite, I would imagine. This is Mr. John. It's the hat Primavera, which dates from about 1950. Rather than being decorated with roses, this hat takes the form of a rose. It's entirely covered with pink rose petals, cotton rose petals, and it's strewn with various flowers, including tiny wild roses. I did masses of research at the museum and really studied the flowers. On the right, you can see it's one of my research photographs. It's a detail of the interior of one of the flowers. And then here we have a special hat which we bought for the exhibition by Stephen Jones from 2008. And he advised that he actually makes the roses in his own atelier. And this collection was inspired by My Fair Lady, which was all about a flower seller. These are more of my research photographs. I really studied sort of material culture analysis, detailed study, the stems, the leaves, the roses, the stamen. I measured them. Often they've got different fabrics front and back. And this extraordinary image by Eileen shows a detail of a huge cluster of roses which are on the top of the crown of a 1908 hat. And in about 1908, hats were very wide brimmed with very broad crowns. And this hat is the crown is completely covered in these luscious dark red silk roses, some with silk tulle around the edges, and a combination of cotton and velour rose leaves. When we first looked at it, the flowers were really fragile. Often silk flowers don't survive because the silk is so fine it shatters. So I was absolutely delighted when the senior conservator at FIT, Anne Coppinger, and her team agreed to work on this hat and restore the roses to their original glory. As a curator, we spend a lot of time looking in detail at objects. It also felt appropriate that I should undertake slow looking at roses. I should look at the rose in detail. So I started examining the form of a rose. I cut some from my mother's garden with a scalpel. I looked at the anatomy of the rose and started to learn about the physicality of the rose in the same way that I did a material garment. I also undertook research at Rosemakers. On the left is Maison Legeron Atelier in Paris. This artificial flower making firm was established in the early 18th century in the Rue Saint-Denis area of Paris. And today they continue to make the most exquisite top level flowers for elite fashion houses. And on the right, there's a working museum quite near to where I live on the south coast of England called Shirley Leaf Petal Company. And these show you some of the historical moulds that the firm still uses, as indeed de Maison Legeron, to make flowers. When you're writing a book, you have the opportunity to put masses and masses of detail in. So the weeks and weeks of research, you can communicate effectively in the context of the book. So here's a double-page spread from the book where I talk about making black roses, which were funereal roses and were a UK speciality, and looking at rose making in New York. I also look at every process of every stage involved in the making of a rose. Now, when it comes to communicating this information in an exhibition, as a curator, you have to condense that huge amount of information into a concise panel. This is my first draft panel. I should emphasize it's not the final panel. It's still slightly long, but it reads, the artificial flower making industry has flourished in the major fashion cities, Paris, London, and New York, from the 1860s to the early 1960s. The trade was seasonal, feathers were more popular in winter, and over 90% of the workforce was female. In Paris, flower making was a specialist craft learned by apprenticeship. Rosemakers were the most highly skilled and best paid of all flower workers. In Paris, demand for roses was so consistently high that some workshops specialized in making only the flower or its bud year-round. In New York and London, with few exceptions, flower making was a mass-produced sweatshop industry that exploited adult and child labor. In each city, workers were exposed to toxic, sometimes deadly, red and green dyes, while heating fumes and poor lighting damaged lungs and eyesight. By the 1960s, the artificial flower making industry fell into decline as fashion clothing became more informal and hat wearing waned. Today, only a few specialist firms survive. When I worked at the V&A, I used to dream about writing a book for children where the protagonist was stuck in the hat store. I don't have photographs of the hat store at FIT, so I thought I would include a picture of the illustrated book I wrote called Clara Button and the Magical Hat Day, with illustration by Emily Sutton, of Clara, who is stuck in the hat store at the V&A with real hats on the shelf, which we might liken to the store at FIT. And behind Clara, to the right, we can see a hat with a purple bow covered in the most glorious yellow roses. So from the micro, looking at the absolute tiny detail of the artificial roses, to the macro, to looking at the hats themselves. We went right through all the hats, we pulled out all the rose-themed hats, and then I started to classify them. So these are just my sketches of the different types of hats, the way I classified them. And I classified them in this way because I'd asked for them to be displayed on hat stands, which might be likened to plants. So here we have a group of hats which I've described as skull caps with roses. Here we have a group of black straw hats that are variously rose decorated. On my left we have miniatures, and on the right again the black straw hats. On the left we have small round hats. On the right, hats that could loosely be described as turbans or in that style. The exhibition's arranged into two core galleries. The first is the Rose Garden of Hats, and the second is the Rose Garden of Fashion. The Rose Garden of Hats will show a mass of hats from the museum collection. So this is my working panel for it. There's a lovely quote by Richard Barnsley Sheridan, and it says, "Won't you come into my garden? I would like my roses to see you." And then I just go on to say that the museum has an exceptional collection of hats. They've been arranged into rose-themed groups, and that as artificial flowers are so delicate, very few from the 18th century survive. And that thorns, which, as I said earlier, they symbolize pain, sin, and sorrow, they very, very rarely appear in 3 dimensions on hats. But I'm very fortunate to be working with Ackert Architecture, Kim Ackert, who regularly works with the museum at FIT, and also designed Colleen Hill's amazing Fairy Tales exhibition, and I believe the ballet exhibition, or dance exhibition. So here's another sketch of my classification of hats. These are all inspired by, they're either in the form of rose petals and leaves, or they're entirely decorated with them. And at the back, you can see the design that Ackert Architecture have designed for the Rose Garden of Hats. And here are some further images with, as you can see, the hat stands that are going to take the form of shrubs. The second gallery is called the Rose Garden of Fashion, and on the right there's another installation designed by Ackert. So the second gallery is devoted to garments, and there's a small display of accessories. This is the exhibition board. It's a photograph of the exhibition board, a snap that I took in Colleen Hill's office in 2019, at a time when we couldn't have imagined a world with COVID. So this was our working object list. The clothes in the Rose Garden of Fashion have been themed by colour. The first colour is red, and here we have Halston's extraordinary dress of called American Beauty, which is the name of a French rose, which the Americans renamed American Beauty. And on the right, Comme des Garçons' trouser suit, which is a very sort of modernistic interpretation of roses, because rather than applying extraneous decoration, the rose forms have been formed by sort of twisting and clustering the fabric. And Alexander McQueen, I've hailed as fashion's rosarian, the designer of all time who used, and whose firm continues to use, the rose as a defining signature. This bag was bought for the exhibition, designed by Sarah Burton for Alexander McQueen, and it's called Rose's Knuckle Duster Bag. The next section is classified by roses that are pale pink and cream. This is the section which often has roses associated with rites of passion, romantic roses. On the left is a bridal vest, which I actually bought at auction because it was so special. It was bought by a romantic groom in the mid-19th century, and the flowers all have various symbolic meanings to do with infinite joy and longing, and the blue flowers are borage. On the right is a garment with a subtle design of roses in the silk and a cluster at the high ribbon by Lucille, who was another designer who was absolutely famous for using tiny rose decoration on her fashions. Very differently, the black transgressive rose, because there are no truly black roses in nature. Some of the exhibit include Harry Gordon's rose dress from 1968, and a number of garments made using lace with a rose motif. Here we have Terry Mugler's haute couture evening gown from 1994. We only have a very little jewellery in the exhibition. In fact, actually, this is the only piece. It's a vulcanite bangle that was worn for mourning in the 1880s. When a man died, a woman in some cultures went into mourning in wearing black dress. In the first phase, they didn't wear jewellery at all, and then maybe in the second and third phases, they might wear jewellery made from a black material, such as jet or vulcanite. And here we have a bangle with a three-dimensional rose design. Now, when you're organising an exhibition, you only see what you're looking for. So I was looking for rose-themed hats and garments. But a number of dresses, especially for special occasions, are designed plain for the very express reason that they're going to be worn with the most gorgeous jewels which have to be highlighted. Now, within fashion exhibitions, we can't exhibit fine jewellery, not least because we don't have the casings, it's high insurance. But as a result, they're often left out of the debate. So whilst we're not exhibiting luxury, highly precious jewellery in the exhibition, we have considered it in the book, and I was delighted that the specialist jewellery historian and presenter on Britain's Clothes Show, Britain's Antiques Show, forgive me, Geoffrey Munn wrote a chapter. Here in the picture we can see a wreath and matching earrings of rare coloured diamonds. The diamonds are in the form of roses, and I don't know if you can see, but all around are these exquisitely depicted bumbling bees. A lot of the garments in museum collections are female garments. In this exhibition, even more so. But we do have examples of rose-decorated fashion worn by men in the 18th century, which predated the 19th century, which was a time when roses and flowers became gendered feminine. Certainly going right back, roses weren't gendered feminine. In Roman times, it was men that wore who wore rose-scented perfume, and men who were awarded garlands of roses for sort of great acts. So Colleen wrote the chapter on 18th century fashion in the book, and these are some of the wonderful examples of 18th century dress in the museum's collection, which we'll be exhibiting. This is in a section called Mixed Bunch, which I use to describe like a sort of mixed bouquet of colours that weren't red, black, or white pale pink. This is a design by a designer called Neil Grotchinger, who works under the name of Nil in New York. It's an example of gender-neutral fashion from fall 2019. And he used, in this outfit, which we bought for the museum, 5 different types of lace with rose patterning, which he cut into sort of an easy sportswear style and then spray painted to give it a sort of modern edge. I asked him about this design, and he told me, and I quote, "I find the rose to be a very empowering flower. It is symbolic of virility and strength." And he says that in his work, he tries to draw out extremes of sort of conventional gender binary garments, and then he tries to negate these qualities. I'd just like to conclude by saying I've been completely delighted to have the opportunity to work with Valerie Steele, Colleen Hill, and the incredible team at the museum at FIT. I'd also like to thank Tania Melendez-Escalante for organising this conference. And I pass my final words to the writer George Eliot, whose astute observation is as relevant today as it was over 100 years ago. It will never rain roses. When we want to have more roses, we must plant more trees. Thank you.